Hi, I'm interghost and today I'll be talking about the Magic Knight series made by David Jones in 1985. Now this is a series of games which were made by Mastertronic, where they used the main character, the Magic Knight, and he made 4 games in the series. The first one was called Finders Keepers, then there was Spellbound in the same year, followed by TYME in 1986, and then finally he brought out the 4th in the series called Stormbringer in 1987. Now the first game was really a action platform game with some adventure aspects in it, and the other 3 were graphic adventure games, which were the games he was trying to make originally. He was a big fan of adventure games back in the day where you had to type in commands and work your way through the adventure, but he said he didn't like the rubber keys on the Spectrum, so he tried to make it graphical so you could do all the selections using the joystick. He had help with the graphics from a guy called Ray Owen, and the first game, Finders Keepers, was released on the budget label for £1.99. So the first game was released on the 48K Spectrum, and basically the idea behind the first game is the king has ordered the Magic Knight to go to a place called Sprite Land and bring back a birthday present for the princess. Magic Knight is transported to the castle, can either amass as much treasure as he can and then try and escape, or he can try and get back to the king and give him the present for the princess. So there was 2 ways of completing the game. Now the reason that there was 2 ways to complete the game was apparently originally all you had to do was get the present back to the king, but at the time Mastertronic wanted the game to be more educational, so they wanted the items to have monetary values so that you could collect items and trade items and try and collect up as much money as you can. In that way kids can use it as a way to add up money, and yeah, for some reason they wanted it to be more educational. Like I said, it's a flip screen platformer game. In this one the Magic Knight is sort of like a small squat sized Magic Knight character, the sprites, which I preferred to the other games, whereas in the other games Magic Knight was quite a tall, lanky character. Now the screens are filled with lots of different monsters. There are spiders, or I used to think they were octopuses or octopi, but by playing the Commodore 64 version I could see that they had spider webs, so I never knew that until my adult life, that these were actually spiders. So they had spiders and worms or snakes, and they had a character which I thought looked a little bit like Ed the Duck. As well as the platform levels and Finders Keepers, there's also 2 mazes which you could walk through, and the mazes scroll around, so it was a totally different style to the platforming on the game. You had the cold upper maze and the slimy lower maze, which in the Commodore 64 version they were called the Castle Gardens and the Castle Dungeons. You had to go around picking up objects and utilising them, trading them. Some objects could actually be combined together to make other objects. For example, you had the Philosopher's Stone and the Iron Bar. You could make a gold bar. A pile of mud and a spark of life, you can make a mud monster. Empty bottle and a model of the Cutty Sark, you could make that into a ship and a bottle. And a broken sword and the blacksmith could be turned into the Excalibur, which is a very expensive item in the game. You had 4 lives to complete the game in, and an energy bar. Every time you hit a moving monster, or on some parts of the game if you walked across certain parts on the floor, your energy bar would go down. When it hit the bottom you would lose a life. So to actually escape the castle you had to kill the Puss Without Boots. So there's a giant cat guarding the exit, and to do this you'd have to drop sulphur and charcoal in front of it to make gunpowder, and then drop the magic flame on that to blow the cat up. There's actually a remake to this game made by Old Games, and this was made in 2007, and I've actually had a look at it and it is pretty decent. This game was also released on the Amstrad CPC, the MSX, the Commodore 64 and the Commodore 16. So if we move on to Spellbound, which was the second game released in 1986, this was also released on the 128K Spectrum, and it came out on the Mastertronic Added Dimension label, which were games made by Mastertronic which they thought were better than their budget games, so they could charge £2.99 instead of £1.99. Now in this game, the wizard Gimbal has accidentally mixed up a spell, and he's cast it on himself and the Magic Knight and some of his friends, and it's gone wrong, and it's sent them off to an unknown castle. You got to try and find Gimbal and reverse the spell and send everyone home again. This is a departure from the Finders Keepers games, and like I said before, it's more of an adventure game. Magic Knight, as you can see, is increased in size, and there's not really any more monsters in this game. There are a few moving objects which you have to get past, which makes your energy go back down. This was the first in the Magic Knight series to use the Window Nation menu system. So instead of typing in commands, you could just select what you wanted to do. The creator got this idea from looking at the Apple Mac and seeing the Windows system, and he thought he'd like to do this on the Spectrum, and it worked really well. You can now interact with other objects and characters, and if you look at the Magic Knight's stats, he has energy and other factors which change the way the game is played. The 128K version of this game has a much bigger map and has music. The game was also released on the Atari 800, Atari XL and Atari XE, also on the Commodore 64 and the Amstrad CPC. There were some references to well-known characters in the game. A good example of this is Florin the Dwarf, which is obviously a rip-off of Thorin the Dwarf from Lord of the Rings. There's also an object in the game, the prism, which was completely useless, and the reason they put this in the game was it was a dig at prison consumer products who they tried to make a deal with, and it didn't go through at the time, so they thought they'd put an item in the game, the prism, which actually didn't do anything. When you're outside of the screens, the characters do move around. It made it so you had to try and find different characters to interact with them. Also, when your Magic Knight moves in and out of screens, he loses a little bit of health, which sort of makes it so you have to do the game in so many moves to complete it, so it would take several attempts to complete the game. You had to maintain some of these characters also, as they would fall asleep and grow hungry, and you'd have to find things to help them wake up or to feed them. You could cast spells in this game by collecting the right objects, and also you could go up and down different floors in the game using the lift, from the roof garden right down to the basement. There was also a time limit in the game of 48 hours, and this was in-game time. If you didn't complete the game within this 48 hours, the Magic Knight would also die. So it means you couldn't leave the computer going, you'd have to do it in a certain amount of time. I've had a look on the internet, and there does seem to be a remake of this game in the pipeline also, but it seems to have stopped for some reason. Also, back in the game, somebody tried to release another game called Crime Busters, which is basically the same game, but they'd hacked the code and replaced all the characters and items with other characters and items, but the map and the idea behind the game was exactly the same as Spellbound. So they got the games all recalled and the games were taken off the shelf. So moving on to the third in the series, Nighttime. Now this was released in 1986, again on the MAD label for £2.99. It's also released on a couple of compilation discs. Now the story behind this one is after freeing Gimbal, the spell to send the Magic Knight home to the Middle Ages has gone wrong again. Magic Knight then ends up on the USS Pisces in the 25th century. You must find your way back to the Time Guardians and return home. So this is the same sort of game as the previous game, and it also introduced the advert into the game, which was a funny little item which you could open up and read, and it would tell you about the other games in the series. But you could also use the advert as a stepping stone to get to high places. First of all, you had to repair the ship, and then you could travel to different planets. Some of them are friendly, some of them are not. The music in this game is really good. It's written by a guy called Rob Hubbard, and on the Commodore 64 by a guy called David Whittaker. This game was released on the Spectrum 48K and 128K. Again, it was cut down for the 48K version without the music and less screens. Also released on the Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64 and the MSX. This was quite strange for the time, but this game was released on the 128K version first, and then on the 48K version afterwards. So to complete this game, you need to find the golden sundial and then create a time machine. This was a lot easier than it sounded. On this game though, you didn't have to concentrate so much on your health, so it was more of an adventure game. Although there were some screens in this game which you could have instant death in. This was a little bit like Spellbound. This game had some space travel in it, and also you must keep an eye on your fuel levels. otherwise the game will be over. Now finally, on to the fourth in the series, Stormbringer from 1987, also released on MAD for $2.99. So on returning from the 25th century, Magic Knight finds the village has been terrorised by the Off-White Knight, who has taken residence in the castle. We find out that the Off-White Knight is really the evil side of the Magic Knight, and the task is to join the two halves back together again. So again, this is more of the same adventuring type of game. And apparently the creator of the game said by this stage he had been getting bored of making these style games, and this one took him over a year to produce, as he'd like to push, every time he created a new game, he'd like to push the boundaries of the game as much as he could. By this time he said there wasn't much more he could do with the 128k games, and sadly this was why this was the final game in the series. He has said in a recent interview with Retro Gamer in issue 27 that had he made a fifth in the series, he was going to do a big reveal that the Magic Knight was actually a female. Also, he said that he would make the games predominantly on the Atari ST rather than the ZX Spectrum. But back to Stormbringer, this is a larger game than the others, and it's got a more varied map. The puzzles were a lot harder, and there was a lot more characters to interact with. So your first challenge was to find a job at the castle and to use a disguise to get in. Again, the 128k version was a lot bigger and also had the in-game music. But you could also get the game on the Commodore 64, the Amstrad CPC, the MSX, and for the first time on a 16-bit computer, the Atari ST, which was basically a port of the 8-bit version, but with better graphics. Now the game's called the Stormbringer because the other enemy in the game, apart from the Off-White Knight, is somebody called the Stormbringer who flies around in a cloud and tries to kill the Magic Knight. You do lose energy going from screen to screen, much like the Spellbound game, and also you lose health when being hit by moving objects. So it looked like, although he was trying to press forward with the game, he decided that the Spellbound version of the game was the best in the series and sort of went back to that version of the game, away from the adventure style. Like I said recently in issue 27 of Retro Gamer, they did interview David Jones, and basically what he's been doing since he'd made this trilogy is he's gone on to work for Psygonis and also Acclaim, but in 2002 he retired and he is now working as a landlord and part-time blues player, and he plays the saxophone in a blues band. He told Retro Gamer that Finders Keepers took him 12 weeks to make, so that was only 3 months, and the Magic Knight character was actually based on an old photo he found in a public domain book. He made the game up as he went along, and then he took it to Mastertronic, who said they wanted to make it more of an educational game, like I said before. And at the time they didn't have a title for the game, so they looked around and there was a movie out at the time called Finders Keepers, so they thought they'd release it with the same name and try and cash in on some of the free publicity people might have brought the game, thinking it was something to do with the movie. The game sold 330,000 copies, and from that 199, David received 10p off of each copy sold. So that would mean he'd made about £33,000 for 3 months worth of work. He went back and made the second game, Spellbound. This took him 5 months to make, using the new Winimation application which he put into the game. This only sold half the amount of the original game, but as it was on the £2.99 range, it was still a huge success. This was followed by Nighttime, which he used the first time he used 128k Spectrum, and then followed by Stormbringer. David Jones said he's also considering bringing out the fifth in the series, but he would need to talk to a few programmers. I hope you like the review. Please remember to rate this video, leave a comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching.